The call came at 2 in the morning. Matteo Romano was not asleep. Men like him rarely slept, not deeply, not without one eye open and one hand near the beretta on his nightstand. He had been standing at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his Chicago penthouse, watching the city bleed its neon light into the dark river below, when his phone lit up with a name he hadn't expected. Carlo Moretti, his future father-in-law. He answered on the second ring, said nothing, and waited. That was the Romano way. You let other men break themselves against your silence. Matteo. Carlo's voice was fractured. A man who prided himself on never showing weakness, now barely holding himself together. There has been a situation. Speak plainly, Carlo. A pause. The sound of a man choosing his words like a surgeon choosing instruments, each one capable of cutting in the wrong direction. Valentina is gone. The city below continued to pulse. Matteo felt nothing shift inside him, which told him more about his feelings for his fiancée than anything else ever had. He should have felt rage. He should have felt the hot, animal thing that men call jealousy or heartbreak. Instead, he felt the cold, clean clarity of a problem that needed solving. Gone, he repeated. She left a letter. There is a man. She has been... Carlo broke off, and when he spoke again, his voice had aged 10 years. She has been seeing someone in secret. A musician, a nobody. She says she loves him. Matteo turned from the window. His penthouse was a monument to controlled elegance. Black marble, steel, the occasional piece of art chosen not for beauty, but for investment value. Everything in his life had been chosen that way, including, he now understood with crystalline certainty, his fiancée. The wedding was in 4 days. The alliance between the Romano family and the Moretti family, two of the most powerful crime organizations operating between Chicago and New York, had been engineered over the course of 2 years, built on handshakes and shared interests, and sealed with the promise of a marriage that would bind the bloodlines. Without that marriage, the alliance was nothing more than a gentleman's agreement between men who had never, in their lives, been gentlemen. This cannot become public knowledge, Matteo said. No, Carlo agreed. It cannot. Then we need a solution. Another pause, longer this time, the kind of pause that contained a question that a man was ashamed to ask. There is something, Carlo said slowly, something I must ask you, Matteo. And I ask it understanding that you have every right to refuse. I ask it as a man who is humiliated by his own daughter's choices and who is trying, desperately, to hold what is left together. Ask. Isabella. The name meant nothing to him at first. Then memory supplied it. A face glimpsed at family dinners, a quiet girl who sat at the far end of the table and passed the bread and never quite met his eyes. Valentina's younger sister, younger by 3 years, which made her 24. Dark-haired, where Valentina was blonde. Soft-spoken, where her sister had been performatively vivacious. She is 24 years old, Matteo said. Not a refusal, an observation. 24 and unmarried and... Carlo's voice dropped to something that might have been grief. She has agreed. I did not ask her to agree, Matteo. I want you to understand that. I told her the situation, and she said yes before I finished explaining it. That is the kind of woman she is. Matteo was quiet for a long moment. Outside, far below, a siren wailed and faded. Someone, somewhere in this city, was having a worse night than he was. "The alliance stands," he said finally. "The wedding proceeds. Tell her—" He paused, searching for something appropriate and finding only the truth. "Tell her I will treat her fairly." He ended the call, set the phone on the marble counter, and stood very still in the silence of his penthouse. In 4 days, he would marry a woman he had never spoken more than 20 words to. He would marry her because it was necessary, because the alternative was a war between families that would cost more lives than a marriage could ever be worth, because Matteo Romano was above all things a practical man. He told himself that was enough. He stood at the window until the city began to lighten, grey bleeding into pale gold, and he thought about nothing at all. Isabella Moretti had been awake since midnight. She sat in the chair by her window in the Moretti family home on the North Shore, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the lake in the distance shift from black to blue as the night passed. She had a habit of watching the water when she needed to think. Her mother had called it her lake-staring disease, had said it with the particular fond exasperation that mothers reserve for the small, strange habits of daughters they love. Her mother had been dead for 6 years. It was, Isabella thought, perhaps the reason she still reached for the lake when the world grew too heavy. It was the one thing that hadn't changed. The letter she'd found slid under her door was still in her hand. Valentina's handwriting, looping and dramatic even in crisis, covering 2 pages that could be summarized simply. "I'm sorry. I love him. I can't be what they need me to be. You always could. You always were better at it than me." That last line was the one Isabella kept returning to. Better at it. At what exactly? At self-erasure? At making herself small enough to fit whatever shape was required? At looking at a situation where every option was terrible and choosing the one that hurt her the most so it would hurt everyone else the least? She heard her father's footsteps in the hall before he knocked. She had always been able to hear him, the particular heaviness of his tread, the way grief sat in the body and made every step a little more deliberate. Bella. He used her childhood name. That told her everything before he opened his mouth. "I know," she said. He came in and sat on the edge of her bed, and he looked old in a way he hadn't looked yesterday. Old and diminished, the imposing Carlo Moretti reduced by a single act of his eldest daughter to something fragile. "I have to ask you something," he began. "Yes," Isabella said. "I haven't asked yet." "I know what you're going to ask, Papa, and the answer is yes." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the thing he was fighting, the father in him warring with the Don in him, the man who wanted to protect her warring with the man who needed her to sacrifice herself for the family. She watched him lose that fight and felt a complicated sorrow for him that contained no anger and a great deal of forgiveness. "He is a hard man," her father said. "Matteo Romano is not. He is not like other men. He has never been warm. After Elena died—" He stopped. Isabella knew the story, or the version of it that people told. Matteo Romano had been engaged once before, years ago, to a woman named Elena Caruso. She had died in a car accident that some people whispered was not an accident at all, a message from a rival family. Matteo had responded with a brutality that had become legend, and had afterward closed himself off so completely that people joked, in the careful way people joke about powerful men, that he'd had his heart surgically removed. "I can handle hard men," Isabella said. "I grew up in this family." "This is different." "I know." She uncurled from the chair and crossed to sit beside him, and she took his hand the way she had when she was a little girl. "But it's done, Papa. Tell me what I need to know." What she needed to know, it turned out, was very little. The wedding was in 4 days. The dress, Valentina's dress, had been fitted to Valentina's measurements. A seamstress would come in the morning. Matteo Romano had agreed to the arrangement. He had said he would treat her fairly. Fairly. Isabella turned the word over in her mind as her father left and the sky outside began to lighten. Not kindly, not warmly, fairly. She was a practical woman. She could work with fairly. She went to her closet and looked at the few things she would take with her. She had never been someone who accumulated possessions, had always travelled light through life, partly by temperament and partly because she had always had the obscure sense that she was waiting, that her real life was somewhere ahead of her, that the present tense was temporary. Perhaps this was what she'd been waiting for. She almost laughed at herself for that thought. She took the photograph of her mother from the dresser and wrapped it carefully in a sweater and placed it at the bottom of a bag, and then she sat back down by the window and waited for the dawn, and tried very hard not to think about Matteo Romano's face in the photos she'd seen. That cold, beautiful face, those dark eyes that gave away nothing, and failed entirely. The church was full of people who knew. Not the guests. The guests had been told nothing, had received only a brief and carefully worded explanation that circumstances had required a small change to the proceedings, delivered with the authority of 2 crime families behind it in a tone that discouraged questions. The guests knew only that the woman walking toward the altar in the ivory dress was a Moretti daughter, and if she was not the Moretti daughter they'd expected, well. These things happened. The Morettis and the Romanos both had long histories of things happening. But the people who mattered, the underbosses, the consiglieri, the handful of powerful men who stood at the back of the church like sentinels, they knew. Isabella could feel their eyes on her as she walked, could feel the assessment in those looks, the calculation, the silent transaction taking place in the minds of men who saw everything as a transaction. She kept her eyes forward. The dress was beautiful. It had been made for Valentina's curves and adjusted overnight for Isabella's slightly more slender frame, and the seamstress, a small, precise woman who had asked no questions and charged double her usual rate, had done a remarkable job. The silk moved like water. The veil was cathedral length, which Isabella had considered removing but had ultimately kept because it gave her somewhere to look, a layer of gauze between herself and the world. She had no one to walk her down the aisle. Her father had offered, but she had seen the tension in his face, the awareness that he was giving away his second daughter to correct his first daughter's failure, and had told him quietly that she would walk alone. He had looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for, and squeezed her hand once, hard, and let her go. Alone, then. She had always been good at alone. Matteo Romano was already at the altar. She saw him before she reached him, and whatever she had steeled herself for, it wasn't quite this. The photographs hadn't prepared her for the physical reality of him, the height, the broad shoulders in the perfectly fitted charcoal suit, the stillness. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze on the altar ahead of him, and he was so completely contained within himself that he might have been a statue, beautiful and cold, and entirely indifferent to the people around him. Then he turned. Their eyes met across the length of the aisle, and something happened that Isabella had not planned for. Not a thunderclap, nothing so dramatic, more like a small, quiet click, the sound a lock makes when a key that shouldn't fit turns it anyway. She felt it in the centre of her chest and immediately decided to ignore it, which was the most rational decision she had made all morning. She reached the altar. The priest began to speak. Matteo looked at her with those dark eyes that gave away absolutely nothing, and she looked back at him with the composed expression she'd been practicing since 2 in the morning. And when the time came to speak the words, she spoke them clearly and without hesitation, because Isabella Moretti had made her decision, and she did not do things halfway. His voice, when he spoke the words, was low and deliberate. He said them the way he would have signed a contract. And then it was done. The ring on her finger was heavy and cold. She looked down at it once, a flawless oval diamond in a platinum setting, chosen surely by someone's assistant, and then looked back up at her husband. Her husband. What a strange word. What a strange, impossible word. Mrs. Romano, the priest said, and Isabella realized he was addressing her. She had a new name. At the reception, she stood beside Matteo for 3 hours and watched him work the room with the focused efficiency of a man conducting business, shaking hands and exchanging the kind of low, weighted conversation that accomplished more in 30 seconds than most men managed in an hour. He was never rude to her. He touched the small of her back when steering her through a crowd. He answered the questions guests directed at them both, smoothly, with just enough warmth to seem natural, without ever actually generating warmth. He did not ask her a single personal question. He did not use her name once. At the end of the night, when the car came to take them to his penthouse, their penthouse now, she supposed, she sat beside him in the back seat, with 6 inches of leather between them, watching the city lights blur past the window, and she thought, fairly. He said he would treat me fairly. She was beginning to understand what that meant. It meant she would be treated like an asset. A well-maintained, properly valued asset that he had acquired through legitimate channels and intended to keep in good working order. She pressed her lips together and looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the window and told herself that she had known this going in, that she had not imagined something more. Outside, Chicago spread itself in every direction, vast and brilliant and completely indifferent to 2 people in a car not speaking to each other. The penthouse was on the 53rd floor. Isabella stood in the entrance hall, all black marble and recessed lighting, and a silence so complete it felt engineered, and tried to calibrate. She had grown up in a large house. The Moretti home was not modest, but this was different. The Moretti house had been a home in the way that houses become homes over generations, worn in places, over-decorated in others, full of the residue of people living. This place looked like it had been assembled to a specification, as though someone had given an architect a very large budget and the instruction to create a space that communicated absolute power while revealing absolutely nothing about the person who lived in it. She looked around at the clean lines and dark palette and thought, this is a lonely place. The master bedroom is down the hall to the right, Matteo said from behind her. He had taken off his jacket and tie in the car, and she could hear from his voice that he was already thinking about something else. "There is a guest room opposite, if you prefer." "No," she said. She turned to look at him. "I'm your wife, Matteo. I'll sleep in the master bedroom." Something moved in those dark eyes. Not surprise exactly, more like reassessment. "As you like," he said. "I'd like to ask you something," she said, before she could stop herself, before the careful composure she'd been maintaining all day could reassert itself. "Will you tell me the rules?" "The rules?" "Of this arrangement. I think I'd rather know clearly what you expect of me than spend the next year trying to figure it out by feel." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking for warmth you don't have to give. I'm asking for clarity." He was quiet for a moment, studying her in that way he had, not rudely, but with an assessment that was too direct to ignore, as though he were solving a problem and she were the variable he hadn't yet placed correctly. "You'll be present when I need you to be," he said finally. "Family dinners, events, anything that requires the appearance of a functioning marriage. You won't ask questions about my business. You won't go anywhere without letting my security team know. You have a monthly budget." He named a figure that made her blink. "Use it however you like. This is your home. You have the same standing as I do in it." "What about the rest of the time?" "The rest of the time is yours." A pause. "I'm not a man who requires constant company." "I noticed," she said, and watched the corner of his mouth make a motion that was not quite a smile, but was perhaps a first cousin of one. "Isabella." He said her name for the first time, and she noticed, she couldn't help noticing, that he gave it the Italian pronunciation, the soft S, and that it sounded different coming from him than from anyone else she'd ever heard say it. "I won't pretend this is something it isn't, but I'm not—" He stopped, seemed to choose. "I'm not a cruel man." "I didn't think you were," she said. "I wouldn't have agreed if I'd thought you were." Another one of those long assessments. Then, "I have an early meeting. Nico will show you where everything is in the morning." He walked down the hall toward what she assumed was the study, or maybe the bedroom, and she watched him go. And she thought about what he'd said. "I'm not a cruel man." It was a strange thing to need to say, and the fact that he'd felt the need to say it told her something she filed away. The bedroom, when she found it, was enormous and impersonal. A California king bed in charcoal linens, blackout curtains, nothing on the nightstands except a lamp and, on his side, a copy of The Art of War that looked genuinely red. She found, in the closet, a section that had been cleared and fitted with empty hangers. Someone had prepared for her, had made space. She stood and looked at those empty hangers for a long moment, and then began to unpack. And in the unpacking, the small, deliberate act of filling an empty space with the evidence of herself, she felt something loosen in her chest. She was here. She was staying. She would make it work. She placed her mother's photograph on the nightstand on her side of the bed, and when Matteo came to bed 2 hours later and lay down in the dark on his side without speaking, she lay on her side, not speaking either, and listened to his breathing slow, and looked at the ceiling, and thought, Step 1. 3 weeks into the marriage, Isabella had learned the following things about Matteo Romano. He drank his espresso with no sugar and had it sent up from the kitchen at 5:45 every morning before she was awake. He ran 5 miles at 6, regardless of weather, on the private track on the building's 42nd floor. He ate dinner at his desk more often than at the table. He had 4 phones and 3 identities that she was aware of, and probably more that she wasn't. He never raised his voice. When he was displeased, his voice dropped an octave and slowed down, and the people around him became very still, the way animals become still in the presence of something that might eat them. He had a scar along his left ribs that she'd seen once when he'd come out of the bathroom, still damp, and hadn't realized she was awake. It was old, the pale, flat kind that only time makes, and she had not asked about it. He had not, in 3 weeks, touched her. She had not expected he would. She had not wanted him to, or rather, she was very carefully not examining what she wanted, because some examinations were not productive. But she was aware of the not touching as a presence in the room between them, a defined shape made of absence. "You're adapting well," said Nico. Nico Ferraro was Matteo's consigliere, his most trusted lieutenant, and had been born, Isabella suspected, with the particular gift of knowing everything about everyone without ever appearing to ask. He was 43, with a salt and pepper beard and the watchful eyes of a man who had survived long enough in this world to understand that survival required attention. He had, over the course of 3 weeks, become the closest thing Isabella had to a friend in this penthouse. "I'm a fast learner," she said. They were in the building's rooftop garden, a concession to human nature in an otherwise relentlessly designed tower, a stretch of lavender and rosemary and small olive trees that smelled like somewhere warmer. Isabella had discovered it on day 4 and had taken to spending an hour there every morning after Matteo's run, reading or just sitting in the early light. "You're more than that," Nico said, sitting down across from her. He did this occasionally, materialized in the garden as if he'd always been there, bringing with him the 2 espressos that meant he wanted to talk. "Valentina." He paused. "I shouldn't compare." "But you're going to." "Valentina was here for 6 months, for engagements. She complained that the espresso machine wasn't the right brand. She redecorated the guest room twice. She never once—" Nico looked at his cup. "She never once asked Matteo how he was." Isabella looked at him. "Have you seen him today? He seemed—" She stopped. "He seemed tired." "He is always tired," Nico said. "He doesn't sleep enough." "I know. He reads until 2 most nights, and then he's up at 5:45. Nico was quiet for a moment. "You notice a great deal." "I notice everything. It's a habit I can't break." She looked down at her hands. "I don't intrude on it. I'm just aware." "He notices too," Nico said, "that you notice." She looked up at that. Nico met her eyes with an expression she couldn't quite read, something layered and careful, a man choosing exactly what to offer and holding the rest back. "He watches you," Nico said, and she felt something shift in her chest. "When you're not looking. He watched you with the Castellano children at the dinner last Tuesday. You spent 20 minutes drawing horses with the 6-year-old on the back of your place card. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either." Isabella absorbed this. She did not let herself read too much into it. "He watches you" was not "he cares about you." Matteo Romano was a man who watched everything. It was how he survived. "He's assessing me," she said. "Perhaps," Nico agreed. "Or perhaps he's seeing something he didn't expect." She thought about that all day. She thought about it through the afternoon, when she took the car to the public library. She had requested and been granted use of a driver, and, with some gentle negotiation, the freedom to go places without a full security detail, so long as she told someone where she was. And sat for 3 hours with books on the history of the Italian-American diaspora, which she was reading not for any practical reason, but because she found it genuinely interesting. She was still thinking about it when Matteo came home at 9 that evening, a full hour earlier than usual, and found her in the kitchen making pasta. Actually making it. Flour on the counter, dough resting under a towel, and stopped in the doorway with that expression she was beginning to recognize. The one where his face went very slightly still, and he was deciding something. "What is that?" he said. "Cacio e pepe," she said. "I was going to leave some for you in case you came home. But if you'd rather—" "I haven't had cacio e pepe," he said, "since I was 10 years old. My grandmother made it." She looked at him. He said it with a flatness that was not coldness, more like a man reporting a fact he hadn't known he was going to say. "Sit down," she said. "It'll be ready in 20 minutes. He sat. She didn't make a thing of it. She finished the pasta with the brisk efficiency of someone who cooked because she genuinely loved it, and she set a bowl in front of him, and she sat across from him and watched him eat, and thought about Nico's voice saying he didn't look away either. He ate the entire bowl. He said, quietly, "It's good." And the way he said it was so unguarded that she had to look at her own bowl so he wouldn't see her face. She was going to have to be very, very careful. The Valentino Ball, not affiliated with the fashion house, named for a dead patron of the arts who had also been a silent financier of 3 significant organized crime operations, was held every October at the Meridian Hotel. It was the kind of event that appeared in the society pages and also in several active FBI case files. Isabella wore midnight blue. Matteo had not selected her dress, she had selected it herself, with the monthly budget he'd allotted, at a small boutique in the Gold Coast, whose owner had recognized her name when she'd called ahead and had opened the shop on her lunch break without being asked. The dress was Valentina's colour theory reversed. Where her sister would have chosen fire, Isabella chose depth. Where her sister would have chosen something designed to be noticed, Isabella chose something that rewarded being looked at closely. She had not done this strategically. She had done it because she liked the dress. But when Matteo turned from the window at 7 o'clock and saw her standing in the doorway of the bedroom, she understood from the quality of his stillness that the dress was effective. "You look—" He stopped, started again. "We should go." The car ride was shorter than usual because traffic had cleared, and in the smaller space she was aware of him, the clean, sharp scent of his cologne, the way he held himself even when sitting, the contained energy of a man always ready to move. He was looking at his phone, but she had come to understand that looking at his phone did not mean he wasn't also tracking everything in the room. Matteo Romano was always tracking everything in the room. "Marcus Bellini will be there tonight," he said without looking up. "The Bellini from New York. His son, Dante. He has been trying for 6 months to negotiate access to the port operations. I have been declining." A pause. "He will try again tonight, and he will try to do it through you." "Through me?" "He'll approach you when I'm occupied. He'll be charming. He'll ask questions that seem like small talk. He's very good at it." He finally looked up from the phone, and his eyes were direct in a way that was almost startling. I'm telling you this not because I think you'll be fooled. I'm telling you because you should know the terrain. She held his gaze. What do you want me to do? Be polite and say nothing of substance. You're good at that. She considered taking offence and decided against it. I am, she agreed. I've been doing it my whole life. Something moved across his face, too fast to name. At the ball, she watched him work the room with the precision she'd come to admire. There was a certain artistry to it, the way he managed proximity and distance, warmth deployed exactly where it would do the most good, and withdrawn just as efficiently. She stayed close when that served him, and gave him space when that served him better, navigating it by instinct and, she was slowly realizing, by a growing understanding of him that she couldn't entirely account for. Dante Bellini found her at the bar at 10:30. He was objectively beautiful, in a way that was polished to near transparency, blonde, well-built, with the easy confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. He introduced himself and smiled, and made the kind of conversation that was designed to feel intimate and wasn't. And Isabella smiled back, and was lovely and warm and completely impenetrable, and gave him nothing. Your husband is a remarkable man, Dante said, with a lightness that wasn't light at all. He is, she agreed. He's lucky to have someone like you. I think I'm the lucky one, she said, and the remarkable thing was that it came out sounding like she meant it, because some part of her, some complicated, traitorous part she hadn't authorized, did mean it. She felt Matteo before she saw him. That was new. A week ago she wouldn't have recognized the particular quality of attention he directed at her, but she'd learned it now, had learned him, in this involuntary, cellular way that she could neither explain nor stop, and she knew he was there before he arrived at her side and placed his hand at the small of her back. It was different this time, that hand at her back. Every other time it had been directional, steering, guiding. This time it was possessive. This time it was something else. Bellini, Matteo said, and the single name contained an entire essay. Romano. Dante smiled the smile of a man who knew he'd been caught. I was just telling your wife how fortunate you are. I know, Matteo said, and the quality of his voice saying it, the absolute unself-conscious certainty of it, made Isabella turn her head just enough to look at his profile, the hard line of his jaw, the stillness, and feel that small, dangerous click again in the centre of her chest. They didn't discuss it in the car. They didn't discuss it when they got home. But when she was washing her face in the bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror, she noticed that her face was doing something she hadn't told it to do, something warm and unguarded around the eyes, and she pressed a cold cloth against it and made herself breathe. She was a practical woman. She was going to need to be more practical than she'd ever been in her life. She woke to the sound of the elevator. It was 3 a.m, later than usual, but not unprecedentedly so. Matteo kept hours that no ordinary person would recognize as hours, and she had learned to register his returns in the way that she registered weather, as information, not as something that required her to act. But this sound was wrong. She sat up, listened. The elevator, then footsteps, and the footsteps were wrong too, slightly uneven in a way his never were. Matteo Romano walked like a man whose body was a machine he'd maintained to exacting standards. She could hear the difference between his walk and any other man's walk. This walk had a hitch in it. She got out of bed. He was in the kitchen, standing at the counter, his suit jacket off and his shirt stuck to his ribs on the left side in a way that was dark and wet. He was opening the cabinet where she knew the first aid kit was. She'd checked all the cabinets in the first week, a habit she couldn't explain except as preparedness. And his movements were careful and controlled in the particular way that suggested the control was costing him. "Sit down," she said. He turned. His face did something complicated. Surprise, then the thing that replaced surprise when Matteo Romano caught himself having it, which was blankness. "Isabella." "Sit down," she said again, moving to the cabinet, taking out the kit. "Let me see." "It's not Matteo." She said his name the way she'd heard him say things to his men, flat and certain, a statement, not a request. "Sit down and let me see." He sat. She lifted his shirt and did not let herself react to what she saw, because reacting would not help. A graze, not a through and through. The bullet had caught the outside of his ribs and taken a 2-inch strip of skin with it. It had already mostly stopped bleeding. It needed cleaning and closure, and she had everything she needed, and she also needed to not think about the fact that someone had shot at her husband and had nearly... She focused on the wound. "You should have a doctor," she said, cleaning the graze with antiseptic, feeling him flinch under her hands, a tiny, controlled flinch, the body asserting itself despite the man's refusal. "I have a doctor." "Then why didn't you—" "He's in Naperville." "I see." She worked in silence for a moment. "Are you going to tell me what happened?" "No." "All right." She began to close the wound, her hands steady, her focus complete. She had some first aid knowledge. Her father had insisted on it, had said that the women of a family like theirs needed practical skills, and it was serving her now. "This will scar." "Everything scars," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that wasn't about the wound at all. She finished and sat back and looked at him. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the assessment, not the careful distance. Something rawer. Something that looked, briefly, before he pulled it back, like a man who was tired of carrying something alone and had, just for a moment, set it down. "Does it hurt?" she asked. "Yes." She appreciated the honesty. She went to the kitchen and came back with a glass of water and 2 ibuprofen. She hadn't reached for anything stronger because she didn't know what he'd had tonight, and mixing things was dangerous, and she held them out. He took them. His hand, when it closed over hers to take the glass, held for a half-second longer than necessary. She looked down at their hands, her brown fingers, his larger ones, dark with a working man's capability despite the suits, and then up at his face. He let go. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, and the weight he gave them was so different from his usual tone, more exposed somehow, like something from beneath, that she had to breathe carefully to keep her expression neutral. "You're my husband," she said. This is what I'm here for." "Is it?" He was watching her again, that direct, too perceptive attention. "Is that what you think you're here for? Isn't it?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "You should go back to sleep." She went. She lay in the dark and listened to him moving around the apartment, the shower running, the quiet return to the bedroom, the careful way he lay down on his side so as not to pull the wound. She lay very still and did not reach for him, because reaching for him would have been the wrong thing, and she knew it. But in the morning she found that in the night, without either of them choosing it, the 6 inches of distance between them had become 3. He found her library in November. Not an actual library. She had commandeered one of the spare rooms, and in the 2 months since moving in had filled an entire wall of shelves, because the budget was generous and books were the one thing she never felt guilty spending money on. She'd ordered the shelves from a carpenter she found through Nico's wife, had assembled them herself with a YouTube tutorial and a borrowed drill, and had spent a very satisfying weekend arranging the books in an order that made sense to her and would have made sense to no one else. She was in the middle of a novel when he appeared in the doorway, and she looked up and then back down at the page before she could register his expression, because she had learned that giving him time to reassemble himself was kinder than catching him at the moment of having a feeling. "What is this room?" he said. "My library." He came in. She tracked him by sound, his footsteps on the wood floor, the small sound of him running his fingers along the spines. She had organised by the thing the books gave her when she read them, the ones she reached for when she was sad, the ones that made her feel less alone, the ones that made the world feel larger, the ones that were just pure pleasure. She knew he wouldn't know this taxonomy, but she found she wasn't worried about what he would make of it. He stopped. She heard it, the cessation of movement. "What?" she asked. "Leopardi," he said. She looked up. He was holding the Canti, the old paperback edition she'd had since university, cover worn soft at the corners. She watched something move across his face, a recognition that was complicated, a man encountering something in a place he hadn't expected to find it. "A te quante donzelle invidiose tendean le mani," he said, and his voice, doing Italian poetry, was a thing she had not prepared for, a thing that moved through her chest like a chord being struck. He was quoting from memory. He was quoting Leopardi from memory. "To the Sylvia," she said. "My mother read it to me." He set the book back exactly where he'd taken it from. "I haven't thought about it in years." She watched him. He was looking at the shelves again, but his focus had changed. He wasn't seeing the books. He was seeing something else, somewhere else. "Did she read to you often?" Isabella asked, and she kept her voice entirely neutral, entirely casual, the tone she used when she wanted to give someone a safe way into a subject. A pause. "She died when I was 11. Another pause, and then, unprompted, "She was the only soft thing in my life until I was—" He stopped. "I became hard because there was nothing left to be soft about." Isabella put her book down carefully. "What happened to her?" "My father happened to her." The words were flat and simple and carried 30 years of very controlled feeling. The life happened to her, the same way it happens to all of us. She didn't say she was sorry. She didn't say anything, because she had learned that some people don't want condolence. They want to be heard, which is a different thing. "I think," she said, slowly, choosing the words the way she'd watched him choose words, "that you carry it very well. The softness. You've just learnt to carry it somewhere it doesn't show." He looked at her, the length of the look, the quality of it. "You say things like that," he said, and his voice was different, quieter, the edge gone from it, "and I don't know what to do with them." "You don't have to do anything with them," she said. I just say them because they're true. He stood in her library for a few more minutes, moving through the shelves in a more deliberate way now, touching the spines, reading the titles. She went back to her book, but didn't absorb any of it. When he left, he took the canty with him. He returned it 3 days later with a note inside, just a few lines in his handwriting which she hadn't seen before, and which was precise and unexpected, the handwriting of someone who had learned from an excellent teacher and retained it. The note said only, "The third poem. Read it again." She read it again. In the margins of the third poem, in pencil so light she almost missed it, was a single annotation in his hand. Yes. She sat with that for a very long time. It was about nothing, the way all first fights in marriages are about nothing, which is to say, they are about everything. She had attended a gallery opening, a fundraiser for a literacy organisation she'd been quietly involved with, spending 3 mornings a week teaching adults to read at a community centre in Pilsen, and she had gone without telling Matteo in advance because she hadn't thought she needed to. She had told Marcus, her driver. She had been home by 10. She had done nothing remotely actionable. He was in the living room when she got back, standing, not sitting, not working, standing, which meant he had been standing there for some time, waiting. His phone was in his hand, and she could see from his stillness, that particular density of it, that he was angry. "Where were you?" he said. She stopped in the doorway. "The gallery opening, the Chicago Literacy Project." She paused. "I told Marcus." "You told Marcus." He set the phone down with a precision that was its own kind of violence. "There was an incident tonight, 2 blocks from that gallery. One of the Vitali men shot in a car 2 hours ago." She had not known this. She absorbed it. "I'm fine, Matteo." "You are fine," he said, and the repetition had an edge in it, because the incident was 2 blocks away, and you were apparently home by 10, and I am— He stopped, seemed to make a decision. "The Vitales know who you are. They know what you are to me. If they wanted to send me a message, then my not going to the gallery wouldn't necessarily help," she said, and watched him pause, because she was right, and he knew it, and logic was a language he couldn't argue with. "Matteo, I am careful. I need to know where you are," he said, and the "I need" startled her, the directness of it, the admission in it. He was not a man who said "I need" easily. "That is all I am asking. I need to know where you are." She took a breath. "All right, I understand." She crossed the room, and she did something she had not done in the 2 months they'd been married. She touched him first. She put her hand on his arm, and she felt the muscle under her palm. Rigid, wound, held. "I'll tell you next time. Not because you're—" She searched for the word. "Not because you own my movements, but because I understand that in this world, what I do affects you. And because—" She stopped. "Because what?" "Because I care what affects you," she said quietly. "I've been trying not to. It's not going particularly well." He looked at her hand on his arm, looked at her face. He was very close, closer than they usually stood, and the air between them had changed quality, become denser. "Isabella," he said. "Don't," she said. "Don't say anything careful right now." He didn't say anything careful. He didn't say anything at all. He lifted his hand and touched her face, just the back of his fingers against her cheekbone, a touch so contained and so deliberate that it was more intimate than anything more obvious would have been. And she held very still and let him do it, let herself feel the warmth of it, the weight of it, the thing it meant. Then he lowered his hand and stepped back, and the moment closed. "I have calls to make," he said. "I know," she said. She sat in the kitchen for a long time after, not reading, not doing anything, just sitting with the feeling. Outside the windows, the city was doing what it always did, endless, indifferent, brilliantly lit. And she thought about the way his fingers had felt against her face, and she thought, I am in an enormous amount of trouble. In the morning he came to the kitchen before his run and found her already up, already making coffee, and he stopped in the doorway and she handed him his espresso without turning around, and he took it and said, "The gallery, next Tuesday. I'll take you myself." She turned. His expression was not soft, exactly, but it was the closest thing to open she'd ever seen on him. "All right," she said. He drank his espresso. She drank hers. Outside, the city was turning gold. December arrived and brought with it the particular quality of a city preparing to be beautiful. Isabella had always loved Christmas, loved the irrationality of it, the collective agreement to be warmer and more generous and more lit up than usual, the way it made even Chicago's savage winter feel purposeful. She decorated the penthouse on the 1st of December while Matteo was at a meeting, and when he came home that evening to find the living room transformed, she'd been restrained, had not overdone it, had chosen white lights and pine and a simplicity that suited the room's architecture. He stopped in the entrance and stood very still. She watched him from the kitchen doorway. He stood there for almost a full minute, looking at the room, and she thought she saw something flicker across his face, something young, something unguarded, before it settled back into its usual composed surface. "It looks good," he said. She had learned by now that from Matteo Romano, "it looks good" was a near equivalent to enthusiasm. "Thank you," she said. "I stayed with the room's aesthetic. I wasn't sure about the tree, but it's right," he said. He looked at the small, perfect tree in the corner, lit in white and decorated with the plain silver ornaments she'd found, and a single string of tiny brass stars she'd added for warmth. "My mother used to put brass stars on the tree," he said. She had not known that. She couldn't have known that. She had chosen the stars because they were beautiful. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no name for, and then he set down his briefcase and went to his office, and she stood in the kitchen and breathed. The Romano Christmas was an event, a dinner that functioned simultaneously as a family gathering and a state occasion, the kind of meal where someone always died, and someone else got married, and deals were made over the antipasto that would determine the shape of the next year. Isabella had attended as a Moretti all her life. She had understood then that it was theatre. She understood it more viscerally now, being inside it rather than adjacent to it. She sat beside Matteo and played her role, had learned it well enough by now to play it from the inside, which meant it no longer felt like playing. And when his Aunt Rosa, a formidable woman of 70 who had been assessing Isabella since October with the focused attention of someone appraising an investment, leaned across the table and said, "You'll do," Isabella received it as the high praise it was intended to be. Matteo, who had heard, glanced at her from the side of his eye. She looked back at her plate and hid a smile. Later that night, after the guests, after the cars, after the apartment had settled into its nighttime quiet, She found him in the kitchen again, which was becoming a pattern, the two of them orbiting the kitchen in the late-night hours in a way that felt less like coincidence and more like the establishment of a ritual. He poured 2 glasses of wine and set one in front of her without asking. "My aunt likes you," he said. "She terrifies me," Isabella said. "In the best way." "She terrified Elena." He said the name simply, without the weighted pause people usually put around it. Elena could never handle Rosa's directness. She found it hostile. Isabella looked at her wineglass. This was the first time he'd mentioned Elena to her directly. "And I?" "You handled it the way you handle everything," he said. "You found the line between warmth and firmness, and walked it without any visible effort." He looked at her. "You make things look easy that aren't." "They're not easy," she said. "I've just been practicing for a long time." "Your whole life," he said, echoing what she'd said weeks ago, and she understood that he had not forgotten it, that he remembered what she said, filed it, returned to it. "My whole life," she confirmed. They drank their wine. The city outside was doing its December thing, hushed slightly by snow, all the lights doubled in the wet streets below. "What do you want for Christmas?" he said, and the ordinariness of the question was so startling that she looked up. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to. I'm asking what you want." She thought about it honestly. What she wanted was complicated, and some of it was in this room, and none of it was something she should say. "A bookshelf," she said, "for the library. I've run out of space." He looked at her for a long moment, and his mouth did that thing, that almost smile. "All right," he said, "a bookshelf." On Christmas morning, there was no bookshelf. Instead, there was, in her library, an entirely new room, the wall knocked out, the adjacent room incorporated, the whole space fitted with floor-to-ceiling custom shelves in dark walnut that smelled of fresh wood and care, with a window seat built into the far wall and a reading lamp positioned at exactly the right angle. She stood in the doorway for a long time. Then she went and found him at breakfast, and she said, "Matteo." And he looked up from his phone, and she said, "Thank you." And she kissed him on the cheek, just that, just her lips against the hard line of his jaw, and he went very still. And she went back to the kitchen to make coffee, and she felt the print of her lips against his skin and thought about what it meant to be in trouble. This deep. This kind. It happened on a Wednesday, not a significant Wednesday, no event, no crisis, no carefully chosen moment. She had been reading in the new library, and he had come looking for her. She had heard him in the apartment, the particular quality of his search, the way a man moves when he's looking for something he wants to find. And he'd found her in the window seat, with a blanket and a worn copy of Middlemarch, and the evening light was the warm amber particular to January sunsets, and it was on her hair. He stood in the doorway. She looked up. "I've been thinking about something," he said. "What?" He crossed the room and sat on the edge of the window seat, and she pulled her feet in to make room, and they were very close. She could see the dark of his eyes in detail, could see that they were not uniformly dark, but layered, brown over black, with something in the depth of them that was warm in a way he would never admit out loud. "I've been thinking," he said, more slowly, "that this is not what I expected." "What isn't?" "This." A gesture that took in the room, the space between them, something larger. "You." He stopped. I had decided what this would be. a function, an arrangement. I am good at maintaining those distinctions. I know, she said. You're not making it easy, he said, and it came out with an edge of frustration that was, she realized, not directed at her, or not primarily. It was directed at himself, at the failure of the walls to hold. I'm not doing anything, she said. That's what makes it... He stopped again. The light was doing something extraordinary. Later she would think about this, the way it had cooperated, the way the amber had fallen just so and made the library look like a painting, made everything feel slightly outside of ordinary time. Matteo, she said, and she said it gently, not as a question. He kissed her. Not as she'd imagined, and she had imagined, in the private parts of her mind she kept carefully away from examination. She'd imagined something urgent, something claiming. But this was the opposite of that. This was slow and deliberate and so terribly careful. A man who was choosing each millimetre of it, and the care in it was devastating. She set the book down. She put her hand against his jaw, the sharp angle of it, the slight roughness, and kissed him back with the same care, the same deliberateness, and felt him exhale against her mouth like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time. When they separated, it was because they both needed to breathe. He looked at her. She looked at him. His hand was still at her face, his thumb at her cheekbone. I didn't plan this, he said. I know. I don't. He searched for words, and she watched it, the rare sight of Matteo Romano uncertain, the man beneath the boss briefly visible. I haven't let myself, in a long time. I know, she said again. I can wait. I'm not asking you to wait, he said, and the directness of it made her breath catch. I'm asking you, he seemed to find what he was looking for, I'm asking you to be patient with me while I figure out how to do this. She looked at his face, looked at the thing in his eyes that was so new and so careful, a lamp just lit. I'm very patient, she said. Ask Nico. He made a sound, short, startled, the most genuine thing she'd ever heard come out of him, and she realized it was a laugh. She stored it like something precious. The first time Matteo Romano laughed in her presence, a sound like an ice wall cracking in a spring thaw. Come to bed, she said, and it meant multiple things, and he understood all of them, and he came. They lay in the dark afterward, in a silence that had completely changed its quality. No longer the silence of two people coexisting by necessity, but the silence of two people who have said something true and are living inside the aftermath of it. His hand found hers in the dark, held it. She thought, I love him. She thought it as simply as she thought anything true. No drama, no panic, just the recognition of a fact. She loved him. She had, she suspected, been loving him for some time, in the accumulated weight of small observations and chosen moments, and the feeling she'd had from the very first evening when she'd told him she wanted the rules and watched his face change. She did not say it, not yet. He was still finding his way toward her. She would not run past him and startle him back. She held his hand in the dark and fell asleep. He was still holding it in the morning. February, and then March. The city thawed slowly, the way cities in the Midwest thaw, reluctantly, in stages, with setbacks, the cold fighting the warmth for every degree. Isabella had stopped paying attention to the temperature months ago. She moved through the city's seasons as she moved through everything, present and observant and engaged, and she was happy. She recognized with a faint sense of wonder, genuinely happy. She had the literacy program, she had the library, she had Nico, who had become something close to a friend in the complicated way that friendship worked in this world, carefully, within understood limits, with mutual affection that was real even within its constraints. She had Aunt Rosa, who had taken to calling her on Wednesday evenings and delivering assessments of the family that were sharp enough to be dangerous and delivered with a warmth that Isabella had learned to receive. She had Matteo. Not all of him. She knew that, knew there were rooms in him she hadn't been given access to, histories she didn't know, wounds she hadn't been permitted to see. But what she had was real, and it was growing. And she thought sometimes that the version of Matteo Romano she was seeing was a version that very few people had ever seen at all. He was different with her than he was with anyone else. She couldn't have described the difference to someone who hadn't seen both sides of it. It was subtle, a matter of degree rather than kind. With his men, he was precise and cold and unquestionable. With his aunt, he was respectful and watchful. With Isabella, he was present. The word she kept coming back to was present, as though she were the only thing in the room that required his full attention. He came home earlier. He ate dinner at the table more often than at his desk. He had, without mentioning it, begun to read in the library in the evenings, not always in the same chair, but close to wherever she was sitting, the two of them reading in the same room, in a silence that was, she thought, the best kind of intimacy, the kind that doesn't require performance. He had begun to tell her things. Not secrets, she was careful not to push him toward anything his position shouldn't allow him to share, but things about himself, small things that accumulated, that he'd wanted to study architecture before the family made that impossible, that he still drew occasionally, that he had a habit of solving problems through movement and found boardroom conversations deeply frustrating compared to walking, that he had not been back to Italy in 11 years, that he kept his mother's rosary in the desk drawer and never prayed, but couldn't throw it away. She held all of it, gave none of it back. It was a kind of trust, she understood. The slow, incremental extension of a man who had been burned and had rebuilt his walls with better materials, and was now, brick by brick, choosing to dismantle them. "You're good for him," Nico told her one afternoon in the garden. "How do you know?" she said. "He laughed at the last board meeting," Nico said. "Actually laughed at something Marco said. Marco nearly had a heart attack." She looked at her espresso and did not say what she was thinking. "He's going to fall," Nico said quietly. "He's probably already falling. He's going to fall completely, and when he does, he's not going to have the language for it. He never learned it. He's going to show it in other ways." He looked at her. "Be ready for that." "I'm ready for most things," she said. "Not everything," Nico said, and his voice had changed slightly, had become more careful. She looked up. "Nico?" But he shook his head. "Nothing, just be ready." She thought about that later, wondered what he knew that she didn't, wondered whether it was about the business, whether some threat was building that she wasn't aware of, some danger she would need to navigate. She did not imagine, could not have imagined, what was actually coming. On the last evening of March, Matteo came home carrying a single stem of freesia. Not a bouquet, not a formal gift, just one stem, in the way of a person who'd seen something and thought of someone. And he handed it to her in the kitchen and said nothing. And she took it and said nothing. and they stood in the kitchen, looking at each other in the deepening evening light. "I love you," she thought, with the clear, steady certainty of a woman who has made peace with a fact. And he looked at her, and she thought she was almost sure that he was working his way towards saying something. But first, the doorbell rang. Valentina was standing in the hallway. She was thinner than Isabella remembered, the kind of thin that was not a diet, but a story, worn in the body. Her hair was longer, darker at the roots, and she was dressed carefully in a way that suggested the clothes had been chosen to project a confidence she wasn't entirely feeling. She had one bag, a canvas tote, and her eyes were the eyes of someone who has been crying for a long time and has recently stopped and is holding the line. And she was, unmistakably, obviously, entirely pregnant. For a moment, nobody spoke. Isabella stood in the doorway of her own home. Her home, she was thinking that, had been thinking it for months, and now the words sat in her chest with a sudden new weight, and looked at her sister, and her sister looked at her, and the months between them were not a long time, but they were enormous. "Bella," Valentina said, and her voice fractured on the single syllable. "Valentina." Behind her she was aware of Matteo, of the quality of his stillness, the particular density of it that meant he was processing something, holding everything still while he did. She was aware of his hand, which had been near her waist a moment ago, dropping away. "Come in." "You don't have to. Come in," she said again. She brought her sister in. She put her in the living room. She got water, because that was what she knew how to do, hands moving, practical, while her mind was somewhere else entirely, somewhere cold and clear, where she was looking at the situation with the part of her that was her father's daughter, the part that assessed threats without flinching. Matteo stood in the doorway and said nothing, and did not move. "Marcus is dead," Valentina said. The musician, the nobody her father had called him. 3 weeks ago, a car accident. She looked at her hands. "I didn't know where else. I didn't have... There's no one else." "How far along?" Isabella asked. 7 months. Silence. "You can stay here," Isabella said. "Bella." Valentina's eyes went to Matteo, and in them was the full weight of everything she'd done, the awareness of what her running had cost, and who it had cost it to. "I can't stay here. You don't have to. I can go to Papa." "Papa's house is not safe right now," Isabella said. It wasn't. There had been threats. She knew enough to know that much. "You'll stay here." She turned and looked at Matteo. His face was an absolute wall. There was nothing on it. Not anger, not pain, nothing. The nothing was worse. She had learned his face well enough to know that this blankness was not indifference, but containment. A man who is feeling everything and showing none of it. "She'll take the east guest room," he said. His voice was entirely flat. "I'll have Nico arrange a doctor for tomorrow." He walked down the hall to his office and closed the door. That night, after Valentina was asleep, exhausted in the way pregnant women are exhausted, profoundly and suddenly, Isabella stood at the window in their bedroom and looked at the city and listened to the silence from the office at the end of the hall. The door was closed. It had been closed for 4 hours. She could go knock. She thought about knocking. She thought about going in and standing in front of him and saying, I need you to tell me what you're feeling. But she didn't. Because what he was feeling was something she didn't have rights to, not yet, or not in the way that would make the conversation safe. Because she was afraid that what was behind that door was not grief over Valentina, but grief over everything. The whole accumulated architecture of loss that he'd built his life inside of. And she wasn't sure she was prepared to stand in the middle of that. She went to bed. He came in at 2 a.m. and lay down on his side without touching her, and the 6 inches between them were back. She stared at the ceiling. She thought, hold on. Living with Valentina was, in its way, its own lesson. Isabella had spent her whole life being the quieter sister, the steadier one who cleaned up after Valentina's messes and smoothed over Valentina's conflicts, and loved her anyway with the durable, exhausted love that is the particular province of the overlooked. She had thought that love would be tested by having Valentina here. She had thought it might break under the weight of the specific, concrete harm her sister had done. It didn't. But it changed. Because the person in the East guest room was not the Valentina who had run away. That Valentina had been careless, bright, gasoline and matches, a woman whose beauty was matched by her capacity for destruction. This Valentina was quieter. She sat in the kitchen in the mornings with both hands wrapped around her tea and looked at the window and looked at her stomach, and sometimes looked at Isabella with an expression that was not quite guilt and not quite sorrow, but something in the territory between them. "You're happy," Valentina said one morning. "I can tell. You always had this thing when you were happy, around the eyes." "Was I?" Isabella said. "Are you?" Valentina asked, and the correction was not hostile, it was a genuine question, or it was trying to be. "Yes," Isabella said, honestly, "I was." Valentina absorbed the past tense. "Because of me." "It's complicated. Bella." She said it the way their mother had said it, and Isabella felt it in her sternum. "You don't have to protect me from the truth." "The truth," Isabella said, considering, "is that I love my husband, and having you here has made things difficult. Not because you're bad, Valentina, because the reminder of how we got here has made Matteo retreat, and I had worked very hard to reach him." Valentina looked at her hands. The silence was long, and in it was a reckoning. "I knew you would be better at it than me," she said. "I knew it that night when Papa told me about the arrangement. I thought the worst thing about running was that I was leaving you behind with nothing. But then I thought, it's Bella. She'll figure it out. She always does." A pause. "I didn't think it would hurt you." "You didn't think," Isabella said, not cruelly, just plainly. "No." Valentina touched her stomach, and the gesture was unconsciously tender. "I never did think." The thing between them did not resolve in that conversation, but it shifted, became something more honest, less performed. Valentina stopped performing contrition, which Isabella found easier to bear, and started simply being present, which was its own form of reparation. Matteo was civil to Valentina. Perfectly, surgically civil. The way he was civil to people he needed to maintain a working relationship with, but felt nothing for. He did not avoid her. That would have required acknowledging her presence more than he was willing to. He simply moved through the apartment as though she were a piece of furniture he had decided to keep, present, accounted for, not requiring engagement. Isabella watched this and thought, He's not in love with her. Had never been in love with her, probably. The cold of the retreat was not heartbreak over Valentina. It was something else. She was almost sure of it. She tested it, carefully, because she needed to know. "Does it bother you," she asked him one night, "that she's here?" "It's your sister," he said. "That's not what I asked." He was quiet for a moment. They were in the kitchen. It was always the kitchen, late at night, their territory. He looked at her over his espresso cup. "It bothers me," he said, "that the reminder of how this marriage started is in my guest room. It bothers me because I had—" He stopped. "I had forgotten how it started." Something unfolded in her chest. "You'd forgotten," she said carefully. "I had stopped thinking of it as an arrangement," he said. He set down the cup. He looked at her directly, in the way that still had the power to stop her breath. "That is not nothing, Isabella. That is, for me, a great deal." She reached across the counter and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "Don't retreat," she said. "I'm not retreating," he said. He looked for the word. "I'm adjusting the variables." She almost smiled. "All right," she said. "While you're adjusting, I'm still here." "I know," he said. "That's the thing, I know." He held her hand for a long time, and outside the city was dark and wet with spring rain, and inside the apartment it was warm. She had been having the headaches since February. She had told herself it was stress. She had told herself it was the adjustment, the accumulated weight of the last year, the particular kind of exhaustion that came from navigating a world she had entered sideways and had been rebuilding herself inside. She was sleeping enough. She was eating well. She was, by every external measure, fine. But the headaches kept coming. She saw the doctor in April, a private physician, not connected to the Romano family, not someone who would report back. She chose him carefully, the way she chose most things, with the thoroughness of someone who understood that the details mattered. She went alone. She told Matteo she was going to the library. She told herself this was because she didn't want to worry him unnecessarily, that this was probably nothing, an easily explained tension headache or a blood pressure issue or something simple. She told herself she would tell him when she had information to share, that it was pointless to mention a concern before it was confirmed. She was lying to herself. She knew she was lying to herself. But the lie was easier than the truth, which was that she was afraid, and that fear was a thing she had very little practice being afraid in front of people. Dr. Conti was thorough. He asked questions, ordered tests, and looked at her with a professional calm that she appreciated and trusted. He was the kind of doctor who didn't rush. He called her back in 5 days. She sat in his office on a Wednesday afternoon in April, while Matteo was in a meeting in New York, and she listened, and her face held exactly still the way she had learned to hold her face, while Dr. Conti explained in careful, measured language what the imaging had found. A glioblastoma, grade 4, in a location that made surgery extremely high risk. The headaches were the presenting symptom of something that had been growing quietly for some time. "What is the prognosis?" she asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. He told her. He told her with the gentleness of a man who had delivered these words before and had not found a way to make them easier and had stopped trying to find one. She listened. 18 months, he said. perhaps 2 years with treatment. The treatment would buy time, but not a cure. There was no cure. "I see," she said. She asked questions, good questions, practical ones, because she was a practical woman, and this was information she needed, and she was not yet in a place where she could afford not to be practical. She asked about treatment protocols, about timelines, about what to expect. She made notes. She was very calm. She drove herself home. She sat in the parking garage under the building for a long time before going up. 18 months. She was 24 years old. She had been married for 7 months. She had spent the last 7 months slowly, painstakingly, building something real out of the unlikely materials she'd been given. Building a life, building a love, building herself inside a world she'd entered sideways. And now she had, potentially, 18 months left of it. She thought about telling him. She thought about walking into the apartment and calling him in New York and saying, "Matteo, I need to tell you something." She thought about his face when he heard it, the blankness that meant he was processing something enormous. She thought about Elena, who had died, and what that had made of him. She thought about what it would do to them, to the fragile, extraordinary thing they had built. If she told him, he would stay. Of course he would stay. He was not a man who left. The tragedy of Matteo Romano was not that he left, but that he couldn't, was bound to everything he'd chosen by a loyalty that was bone deep. He would stay, and he would be afraid. He would pull back, not because he didn't love her, but because he did, and because love to him was something he'd learned to survive only by armor plating. And if he knew she was dying, he would start building the armor now, would start the process of removing himself, of preparing. She would spend the last year of her life watching him leave before she was gone. She could not do that. She drove the car back down to a coffee shop 2 blocks away and sat for an hour and thought with the careful, deliberate thoroughness she brought to every serious problem. And she made a decision. She would not tell him. She would give him the rest, give him whatever was left that was good and real and uncontaminated by the thing coming. She would not let him waste a year of grief on a loss that hadn't happened yet. And when the time came, when it became impossible to hide, she would disappear. She would remove herself cleanly, so that whatever he felt, it would not be pity, and it would not be obligation, and it would not be the horror of watching her diminish. She would give him the dignity of a clean goodbye. She drove home. She made dinner. She was, by every measure, entirely fine. She was careful. She had always been careful. She continued the literacy program. She continued reading, cooking, being present at the events that required her presence. She managed the headaches with what Dr. Conti had given her, carefully dosed, logged in a notebook she kept in the library behind Middlemarch, because she had long ago learned that Matteo did not alphabetize. She was kind to Valentina, who was now 8 months pregnant and enormous, and occasionally afraid in the night, in the way pregnant women alone sometimes are. And Isabella would hear her and go sit with her, and they would talk in the kitchen, in the 3 in the morning dark, the way they had sometimes talked as children. She was present with Matteo, more present than ever, she thought, because she was spending his time with him the way she spent money on the things she valued, with the full awareness that it was a finite resource and every unit of it mattered. She did not tell him she loved him. She had been going to. She had been working toward it, had had it in her mouth on 3 or 4 occasions, the words arranged and ready, had been waiting for the right moment. But after the diagnosis, she couldn't say it. Because if she said it, she would have to say everything, and if she said everything, the plan would come apart. She also thought, if I say it, he'll hear it for what it is, and he'll know something is wrong, because Matteo Romano is not a man who misses things. So she showed it instead, in the meals and the care, and the way she turned her face toward him when he spoke, and the way she always knew where he was in a room. He noticed. Not the absence of the words, she didn't think he was expecting the words, but the quality of the attention, she thought, he noticed. Something had changed in the way he looked at her, more often, longer, more intent. She caught him watching her across rooms, with the expression she had first noticed at the ball, and had since catalogued. Not calculation, not assessment. Something warmer than either. Something that looked very much like... She looked away. She couldn't look at it directly. It was too much. In late May, she started having what Dr. Conti called episodes. Brief moments where the world went sideways, a dizziness that lasted seconds and left no trace. She managed these carefully. She was never alone in a dangerous situation. She sat when she felt one coming. She was getting better at hiding. What she had not accounted for was Nico. Nico, who noticed everything, who had been watching her with an increasingly careful attention over the past month, who had said nothing and asked nothing, but who she could feel at the edges of their conversations doing the math. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning in the garden. "I am sleeping," she said. "I've always slept lightly." "Not like this." He looked at her directly. "I've known Matteo Romano for 20 years. I know what it looks like when someone is protecting him from something." Her hands were steady on the cup. "I don't know what you mean." "Isabella." He said her name quietly. "I am not going to push. I am not going to tell him. But I need you to know that I see you, and that I—" He stopped, and something crossed his face that was not his usual composure. "Whatever you're carrying, you don't have to carry it entirely alone." She looked at the small olive trees in their pots. The spring light was particular today, sharp and bright, the kind that made everything look very clear and very impermanent at the same time. "I'm fine," she said. "You are many things," Nico said gently. "Fine is not one of them." She had been alone with it for long enough. The weight of it had become a specific, physical thing, the way any secret does eventually when the container it's in begins to fail. "Promise me," she said, "that you'll say nothing. Not yet." "Why not yet?" She met his eyes. He read her face. She watched him do it, watched him understand, gradually, the shape of what he was looking at, and watched the colour of his expression change as he put it together. "How long?" he asked quietly. She told him. He was quiet for a very long time. Then he set down his espresso and looked at the garden and said nothing for several minutes. And she was grateful for this, for the gift of someone else absorbing the information without immediately making it about what she should do. "What is your plan?" he said, finally. "To give him the rest," she said, "and then to go." "He will not." Nico stopped, started again. "If you go, Isabella, if you disappear from his life the way Eleanor disappeared, this is different." "Is it?" His voice was very quiet. "Are you sure you're protecting him? Or are you protecting yourself from having to watch him love you while you're dying?" The garden was very still. She didn't answer. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because it was both things, and she wasn't ready to say so. He found the notebook by accident. He had been looking for the anthology of American poetry he remembered seeing in the library. He had been reading more, since Isabella had rediscovered the habit that his teenage self had maintained secretly in the brief and hidden way that private things survived in the Romano house. And he was searching the shelves behind Middlemarch when the notebook fell. He picked it up. He would not have opened it. He was not a man who opened things that didn't belong to him. He had learned early that information was power and that the abuse of access was its own kind of betrayal, and he extended this principle even to his own household. But the notebook fell open, and the name at the top of the page he was looking at was Dr. Conti, and below it were words that he had never expected to read in his wife's careful, small handwriting. He read the page. He read the one behind it. He sat down on the window seat, her window seat, the one with the cushion she'd had made in a fabric that smelled faintly of her, and he read the notebook from beginning to end. He was very still for a very long time afterward. He thought about February, the headaches she had mentioned once and then stopped mentioning, the way she had been holding herself slightly differently for the past month, not in pain, or not obviously, but with a carefulness he had attributed to the tension of having Valentina in the house. He thought about the evenings that had changed in texture, had become, he had thought, warmer, deeper, more intentional. He had thought she was moving towards something. She was. She had been giving him her time with the full knowledge of its cost. He thought about Eleanor. He had to think about Eleanor because any man in his position would. He had loved Eleanor in the way of a young man who has not yet been properly broken, completely, desperately, with the full force of everything he had before the world took it away. And when Eleanor had died, he had decided, with the clean finality that is the only protection a certain kind of man knows how to build, that he would not go through it again. He had gone through it again. Not the same, not the terrified, desperate thing of 25. This was different. This was the thing you built slowly, with the right person, when you were old enough to understand what you were building. This was the thing that was, he understood now, sitting in her library with the notebook in his hands, the thing he had been most afraid of, and had built anyway, without meaning to, without allowing himself to name it. He loved his wife. He loved her with a completeness that his younger self wouldn't have recognized, wouldn't have known to call love. This quieter, rootsier thing, the love that lived in knowing someone's habits and their history and the sound of their particular sleep and the way they hold a book. He loved her, and she was dying, and she had been keeping it from him. He sat with the rage of it, the grief, the thing that was neither. Then he put the notebook back exactly where it had been, behind Middlemarch, facing outward, and he went to find her. She was in the kitchen. She was making lunch, her back to him, moving with the economy of motion she brought to everything, and she was humming. Barely, very quietly, the way she did when she didn't realize she was doing it, and the sound of it was something he would carry in his body for the rest of his life. "Isabella," he said. She turned, saw his face. He watched hers change. She knew. "Matteo, sit down," he said. His voice was not cold. He had thought it might come out cold, had thought the containment would require the cold, but it didn't. It came out something else, something that was the same word his mother had said to him when he was 11 years old, and she was telling him she wasn't well, and she was sorry, and she loved him. "Come, sit down. Let me be with you." She sat. He sat across from her, and he put his hands on the table, and he said, "Tell me." "How did you—" "Tell me," he said again. "Not the facts. I have the facts. Tell me why." She looked at her hands. He waited. "Because I didn't want you to stay out of obligation," she said. "Because I know what it did to you, losing Elena. Because—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened, in the way it did when she was keeping herself together by force. "Because I love you, and I didn't want the last thing between us to be pity." He was quiet for a long moment. "Look at me," he said. She looked at him. "I am going to say this once," he said, "and I need you to hear every word." He held her gaze. "You are not Elena. This is not the same. I am not 25 years old, and I am not going to survive this by building walls, because the walls didn't work. They never worked. You walked through every single one of them without even trying, and I am—" He stopped, breathed. "I am not going to let you disappear. I am not going to let you plan some quiet exit to protect me. You do not get to take that choice away from me. Matteo, I love you." He said it simply, the way she said things that were true. "I am in love with you, and I have been for longer than I knew how to say it. And if you have 18 months, then I want 18 months. I want every morning of it and every night. And if it is less than that, then I want every minute of less. And I will not have you spending what is left protecting me from feeling it." She was crying. Silently. She cried the way she did everything, without excess, without drama, but he could see it in the quality of her stillness. He got up and came around the table and took her face in both hands, and he looked at her. "Let me be here," he said. She closed her eyes. He felt her lean into his hands, felt the whole weight of her, the resistance she'd been maintaining, the aloneness of having carried this for months. "Yes," she said. "Yes, stay." He held her face, and she held his wrists, and outside the city moved on in its indifferent way, and inside the kitchen it was very still and very full of the exact quality of light that comes at the end of the morning. Valentina's daughter was born on the 14th of June. They named her Sophia, and she came into the world at 3 in the morning in the hospital on Michigan Avenue, with Isabella holding Valentina's hand and Matteo standing in the waiting room, because there are some things even Matteo Romano could not arrange. And the nurse came out and said, "She's here." And there was something in the air that changed quality, became briefly extraordinary. Matteo held the baby for approximately 40 seconds, with the controlled carefulness of a man handling something irreplaceable, before handing her back. But Isabella saw his face while he held her, the thing that crossed it, unguarded, just for a moment, and she filed it away. They did not fight about Isabella's treatment. She had expected him to fight about it, expected him to push harder, to demand experimental protocols, to rage against the timeline the way men like him raged against limits. Instead, he said, "I want to understand your choices. Tell me what you want and why, and I will respect it." She had not expected that. She had not expected him to be this. She chose treatment, not aggressive treatment. She had read the research, and she was clear-eyed about what the additional months of aggressive chemotherapy would look like versus the quality of the months with a gentler protocol. But treatment, yes. She was not ready to stop. There was too much yet. He drove her to appointments, not Marcus, Matteo himself, in the black car, in the 6 a.m. light, his hand on hers on the console. He didn't talk in the car because she didn't want to talk. He'd learned this quickly and without being asked. He brought coffee. He was present in the way she had asked him to be, completely and without performing it. The headaches were worse. She managed them. She continued the literacy program until July, when Dr. Conti suggested reducing her schedule. She did not reduce it until she couldn't reasonably continue, and when she finally had the conversation with the coordinator, a small woman named Delia, who had known within a week what Isabella was dealing with and had said nothing, and continued scheduling her and treating her exactly the same, which Isabella was grateful for beyond the capacity of language. She cried in the car on the way home, briefly, and Matteo drove and said nothing, and found a parking lot and stopped the car and held her until she was done. "I keep thinking," she said, when she could speak, "about all the things I won't—" "Stop," he said, not harshly, firmly, the way you stop someone walking toward a dangerous edge. "I have to be allowed to feel it," she said. "You are allowed to feel it," he said. "Feel it, but not the things you won't, the things you are." He tilted her face toward him. "You are here. You are in this car. You are with me. That is what is true right now." She thought about this a great deal afterward, about the gift of present tense, about how Matteo Romano, who had spent his entire adult life planning 3 moves ahead and armouring himself against every possible future, had learned, perhaps was still learning, to live in the now, and was teaching her in the process. She told him about the literacy program, about her students. There was a man named Henry, 62 years old, who was learning to read for the first time, and who cried the day he read a letter from his granddaughter without help. She told him about the woman named Cora, who had been at it for a year and had recently read her first novel, a Maeve Binchy she'd picked from the donated shelves, and had come in the next week with the book pressed against her chest like a heart. Matteo listened the way he listened to her, completely, and she could see him cataloguing it, storing it in the place he stored the things that mattered. "You changed their lives," he said. "They changed mine first," she said. "They reminded me what it was to learn something for the love of it." Valentina, in the East guest room with Sophia in a white crib beside her, had become something new in the household. A third presence, Sophia's small, insistent aliveness, filling the apartment with the particular noise of a life entirely new to itself. Isabella found she didn't mind. Had not expected to find the sound of a baby's existence comforting, but it was. It was profoundly, inexplicably comforting. The absolute insistence of a new life on being present. Matteo looked at Isabella one evening across the dinner table while Valentina was feeding Sophia, and his expression was the one she had never named and now knew. Love. That was what it was. She had been looking at it for months, and now she could name it without flinching. She looked back at him and smiled, just slightly, just enough. And his expression changed in the way it always did when she smiled at him, opening slightly, becoming briefly unguarded. They had this. Whatever time they had this. It was, she thought, more than she had expected from a life lived mostly in the practice of making herself small. It was, she thought, everything. He told her about Elena on a Tuesday in August. They had developed a ritual, Late night, after everything, in the library that had become the heart of the apartment, the room she had made, and that now felt more like theirs than anywhere else. She would read, or sometimes not read, just sit in the window with the city below, and he would sit nearby, and sometimes read, and sometimes also just sit, and they would talk in the way they had learned, easily, without performance, in the register of two people who had decided to be honest with each other. She was 23, he said. I was 25. I had just taken over from my uncle. There was a transition. It was difficult. She was a way out of the difficulty. I am not saying I didn't love her. I did. But I loved her the way you love something when you need it, and that is not the same as... He paused. This. What is the difference? Isabella asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, the kind she had learned to ask him. You, he said. I love without needing. I loved Elena because I needed something soft, and you are also soft, but I don't love you because I need softness. I love you because you are... He stopped, and she could see him searching in the frustration that language produced in him, the gap between what he felt and what words could hold. Because you are entirely yourself. Because you have never once performed anything for me. Because when you came to this apartment, you brought your books and your photographs of your mother and your habit of watching the lake, and you didn't ask permission for any of it, and you didn't apologize for any of it. He looked at her. I had never had anyone who just was themselves, without apology, in my presence. She was quiet for a moment. You weren't easy to be yourself around. I know. You're better now. He looked at her with the expression that was still, after everything, capable of making her breath catch. This open, unguarded face she doubted very many people had ever seen. You did that, he said. In August, the headaches were bad. She didn't tell him how bad, he knew anyway. She had accepted that she could not hide things from him any more, that he had decided to see her and was seeing her entirely, and the only thing she could do was be seen. He would hand her medication at the exact moment she needed it, not because she had asked, but because he had learned the timing. He would dim the lights in the library without being asked. He would drive more slowly when she was in the car. He had become, in the space of a few months, the most attentive person in her life. Not in the way of someone performing attention, in the way of someone for whom attention had become the primary language. I need to tell you something, he said one night. Tell me, she said. I spoke with Dr. Conti, he said. There is a trial in Zurich. A new protocol. It's early stage, but the preliminary data... He stopped. I want you to consider it. I'm not asking you to go. I'm not... He ran a hand through his hair, and she watched him work through the tension of wanting to fix what couldn't be fixed. I know this is your body and your choice. I am asking you to consider it. I've read about it, she said. He looked at her. I have a Google alert on glioblastoma trials, she said. I have for 6 months. He absorbed this. And I have thought about it. I am still thinking about it. She looked at her hands. I want to go to Italy first. Italy. You haven't been back in 11 years. I have never been to Calabria. She met his eyes. I want to see where you're from before... She stopped. He was very still. Before anything changes, she said. He reached across and took her hand, not gently but firmly, the way he held things he intended to keep. Italy, he said, and then Zurich. Let me think about Zurich. Think about Zurich in Italy, he said. We leave next week. She thought about arguing. She looked at his face, the face of a man who loved her and was not going to be deprived of the ability to do it, and she did not argue. All right, she said. That night she lay awake long after he slept, which was itself a change. In the last months he had begun sleeping more, sleeping better, and she had found that she slept less well than she used to, which was partly the illness and partly the accumulation of awareness that had come with the diagnosis, the way the world had sharpened into almost painful clarity. She watched the ceiling and thought about Calabria, about olive trees and the particular blue of the Ionian Sea, and the town he'd mentioned once, briefly, the way you mention your childhood home when you can't quite bring yourself to talk about it directly. She thought about the look on his face when he'd said Italy, something young in it, something that had been waiting. She was glad, she thought, that she had not disappeared. She pressed her hand to his chest in the dark, the slow, steady rhythm of him, and she thought, this. Whatever else, there was this. She thought, I got to have this. Calabria was exactly what she had imagined, and entirely beyond it. They arrived on a Thursday in September, when the south of Italy was still in its summer, the air warm and dense with the smell of the sea and stone, and something older than she had words for, the smell of continuity, of a place that had been itself for a very long time. Matteo drove from the airport with the windows down and said nothing. And she watched his face for the first hour, watched it do something she had not seen it do before. Something that was not relaxing exactly, but returning. The gradual resumption of something that had been interrupted. The house was his grandmother's house. He hadn't mentioned this. She discovered it when the old woman, 91 years old, small as a child, with Matteo's eyes in a face made of weather and time, opened the door and reached up and took his face in both her tiny hands, and he bent down and let her do it. And his face was what she had been trying to see for a year. Open. All the way open. Nothing held back. She stood on the threshold and felt something enormous in her throat, and blinked carefully. His grandmother, Nonna Giulia, spoke only Italian and a personal dialect that was not quite Italian, and she addressed Isabella immediately and at length, and Isabella's Italian was good but imperfect, and she understood perhaps 70% of what was said to her. What she understood was that she had been approved of, and that the approval was both harder to earn and more genuine than almost anything she'd received in the previous year. They stayed for 2 weeks. 2 weeks in which Matteo Romano became someone she was meeting for the first time and simultaneously recognized completely. He moved differently here, less contained, the body easier in itself. He ate without thinking about it. He slept past 7 for the first time in their marriage. He took her to the places of his childhood, the town square, the fishing harbour, the hill above the town where the ruins of a Greek temple sat in the late afternoon light, as though the separation between past and present was a very thin membrane here, easily crossed. I used to come here when I was 8, he said. 9. I would sit up here and think about architecture, about what it would look like to build something that lasted that long. He looked at the stones. I used to draw plans for buildings. She was quiet. She was holding his hand and looking at the stones and the sea beyond them, and she thought, give me all of this. Give me every piece of it. Let me be here, in this moment, fully. Tell me what you imagined, she said. he told her. He told her about the buildings, the bridges he'd designed in his notebooks as a boy, the obsession with tension and structure, the way a building held its own weight against the forces working against it. He talked the way he never talked, freely, without editing, with his hands involved, and she listened, and the light came down in that particular Calabrian way, golden and specific, and she thought, I will remember this. Whatever else happens, I will have remembered this. She had a bad episode on day 9. It came without warning, the world tilting hard, her vision briefly fractured. She was in the garden. She managed to sit before she fell. It passed in 30 seconds. Matteo was there in 40. She did not know how he knew. She was beginning to understand that he simply knew, that this was the thing love did when it paid attention, when it became the primary orientation. He sat beside her on the stone bench and did not say anything for a long time, and she leaned against his shoulder, and the garden smelled of rosemary and sun-warmed stone. I want to call Dr. Conti, he said, finally. Tomorrow, she said. Give me today. He gave her today. Later, in the blue of the evening, she sat with Nonna Giulia on the terrace while Matteo made calls, and the old woman looked at her with those eyes and said something slow and clear enough that she caught every word. It is a good love. Do not let fear make you smaller than you are. She thought about that for a long time. She thought about the notebook behind Middlemarch and the plan she had made in the parking garage in April, and the version of herself who had planned to disappear, to do the kind thing, she had told herself, the loving thing. She thought about Nico's voice asking, are you protecting him or protecting yourself from having to watch him love you while you're dying? She thought, both. Both were true. She had been afraid of being loved through the diminishment, afraid of taking up more space in his life by leaving it. She had been making herself small again, in the oldest, most unconscious way. She went inside and found him on the terrace, phone put away, watching the sea. Zurich, she said. He turned. I'll do the trial, she said. I want to. He was very still for a moment. Then he crossed the distance between them and put his arms around her, and she felt the whole of him, the height and strength of him, the contained, enormous feeling of him, and she put her face against his neck and let herself be held. Thank you, he said, and his voice was the voice from the night she had cleaned his wound, the one that came from below. I'm not doing it for you, she said. I'm doing it for me. I'm not ready. I know, he said. I know you're not. She was not ready. She had 18 months, or maybe less, or possibly she was allowing herself the possibly more. She had this man and this garden and this particular light. She had Sophia growing daily in the East guest room at home, insisting on her own existence with the full force of every new life. She had a library full of books she hadn't read yet. She had students she wanted to see learn to read. She had a husband who had spent 40 years building walls and had, for her, dismantled them with his own hands. She had so much still to do. She held him in the blue Italian evening, and the sea was doing what the sea always does, indifferent, immense, entirely beautiful, and she thought, I am here. I am entirely here. Whatever comes, I was here. And Matteo Romano, who had not believed in love for a very long time, held his wife in the garden of his grandmother's house and thought, "I will find a way to keep her. I will find every way there is, and if there is no way—" He pressed his mouth to her hair. "If there is no way, I will love her so completely in the time that remains that it will have been a whole life. It will have been everything." The light went gold, and then orange, and then the deep rose of a southern Italian sunset, and the sea held all of it, and below in the village the bells rang the hour, and they stayed. They stayed until it was dark. They stayed because there was nowhere else to be, because this was the entirety of the world that mattered, because love, real love, the slow and rooted kind, does not require a future to justify its present, because some things are complete not in spite of their limits, but because of them. Because Isabella Moretti Romano was 24 years old, and she was here, and she was loved, and the light was extraordinary. Zurich, 18 months later. The trial worked. Not the way miracles work, not in the instant transforming way. In the slow, provisional way that medicine sometimes works when it reaches just far enough ahead of what was possible. Dr. Weiss, the trial physician, explained it in the careful language of someone who had learned not to make promises, but was, in this moment, allowing himself a qualified optimism. The tumour had not grown. In the last scan, it had marginally reduced. Isabella sat in the office and heard the words and felt Matteo's hand in hers, his grip too tight, the only outward evidence of what the last year and a half had cost him. And she thought, all right. All right. They went for lunch afterward in a small restaurant near the lake. She ordered pasta, he ordered nothing, and then ate most of hers. "You need to order your own," she said. "I know," he said. He was looking at her with the look, the open one. "Matteo, I was thinking," he said, "about architecture." She looked at him. "I was thinking about taking one class, just to see if I still—" He paused. "I thought perhaps you might take a class too, at the university. English literature." He said it with deliberate casualness, which meant he had been thinking about it for some time. "They have a continuing education program." She looked at him for a long moment, at his face, which was doing something tentative and new, a man offering a version of the future. "Yes," she said. The lake outside was blue. It was nothing like Lake Michigan, nothing like the Ionian Sea. It was its own particular blue, Swiss and cold and precise. And they sat by the window and ate pasta and talked about architecture and literature, and the baby Sophia, who had learned to walk and immediately applied herself to walking into things, and Valentina, who had taken a job with a small music company and was finding, tentatively, that she could build a life. They talked about Nonna Giulia, who had called that morning and said something long and unintelligible and hung up in the way she always did, as though the phone were a device she tolerated rather than trusted. They talked about Nico, who had started making his wife come to the garden on Wednesday mornings, so that now there were 3 of them sitting with espresso in the rooftop garden, and it had become a thing he looked forward to and would not admit. They stayed at the restaurant until the afternoon light had shifted. Then they walked along the lake, his hand in hers, her shoulder against his arm, and the city was clean and bright and ordinary around them. Just a city in the afternoon, full of people going about the business of their lives.
She had 18 months, she had been told, or 2 years. She was still here. She was still entirely here. She held his hand tighter. He held hers back. They walked into the light.